I'm Andy Ivey.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, good evening and welcome to Cross Question, LBC's weekly political panel debate show. We'll be here in LBC's Westminster studio each Wednesday at 8 p.m. on the dot to answer questions from LBC listeners. And as well as listening to us on the radio, you can watch us on Global Player and on LBC's YouTube, Facebook and Twitter feeds. If you'd like to take part in the show and ask our panel a question, all you have to do is pick up the phone and dial 0345 6060 973. The lines are open now. All previous episodes of the programme are on the Cross Question podcast and the show will appear there before midnight. It's time to introduce our panel. In the studio with me in Westminster and socially distanced, I say that every week, are the former Cabinet Minister Andrea Leadsom, former Corbyn Shadow Cabinet Member Richard Burgon, SNP Community Spokesman David Linden and Shabnam Nasimi from the Conservative Friends of Afghanistan. Welcome to you all. Let's go to our first question, and it is, who is it? The first question isn't up yet, which is really, really helpful, so I might ask it myself. Let's start off with talking about the events of the week. Given the Labour Party's breach with the government, I suppose, first time in, 7 or 8 months now. Richard Burgon, let me come to you. You're an MP for Leeds. It's what I think Leeds is the third biggest city by population in the United Kingdom. What are infection rates like in your area? And do you agree with your leader's policy?
Well, the infection rates in Leeds are approaching 400 per 100,000, and they've been increasing, and it's very worrying indeed. And I very much welcomed Keir Starmer's statement yesterday, because we do need a change of track from the government on this. Their approach is failing to save lives, failing to save livelihoods, and I cannot believe for the life of me that Boris Johnson has ignored the guidance and recommendations from the SAGE committee, the scientists, early in September. It really is quite extraordinary. I think that's the main reason that Keir made that press statement yesterday. People obviously are sick to death of the restrictions, but the government's approach has meant we're going to be in and out of these restrictions for so much longer than is necessary. What's happening now wasn't inevitable. It's because of the government's failure to get a hold of the virus, like they have done in other countries such as New Zealand, South Korea.
Do you think that any government, regardless of political colour, should automatically accept recommendations from scientists? Because if they do that, doesn't that mean we have government by unelected scientists? Surely governments have to look at things in the round and look at the scientific evidence, the economic evidence, the behavioural science evidence, and then come to a decision.
The problem with the government's approach on this is that they've ended up in a position where people in the country are debating as if it's a choice between saving lives or saving the economy, as if it's a choice between the economy and public health. Actually, following what's called a zero COVID approach, as has been successfully adopted in New Zealand, in South Korea, Vietnam, for example, would actually allow us to get back to normal more quickly by reducing the virus to such a low level that it's in effect eliminated. And then obviously there are businesses in Leeds who feel they've been hung out to dry, bars, restaurants and the rest of it. The truth is, if the government hadn't messed up testing and tracing by giving so many of the contracts to these failing private companies, if they'd sorted things out, then we wouldn't be in a situation where these businesses would be suffering financially. And of course, the government has to support them. It has to support them. But we're not going to get the economy back to normal if we carry on down this failed route.
Andrea Leadsom, 68% of the British public apparently support a circuit break lockdown. It was recommended by the scientists. Why do you think that might be? There are some Conservative MPs who do think that would be a good idea. Do you?
I think the government has the most difficult path to tread between protecting lives and protecting livelihoods, but also protecting non-COVID related problems and also people's mental health. So there is an impossible squaring of a circle going on here, and what the government's trying to do is to keep the right balance between protecting as many people as possible, getting the R rate down, recognising, what Richard says is simply not true. There isn't a zero COVID approach. That's only if you had 100% successful vaccine or if COVID just mysteriously disappeared. All the scientists have said is that the R rate could be got below 1 through various different methods, but they themselves acknowledge that it's a very fine line to tread between looking after people's well-being, their COVID health and their livelihoods.
David Linden, Nicola Sturgeon has been a little bit quiet, I think, on a circuit breaker lockdown, hasn't she? I haven't heard comments from her today on it. Do you think that it's something the Scottish Government are considering?
Well, 2 days ago, I think Nicola Sturgeon gave an update out to the media and to colleagues in Parliament, suggesting that is something that we're willing to look at. It might be slightly different from what's in place across other parts of the United Kingdom. We're certainly open to all and any ideas to try and get the virus under control. But what we did last week was brought in some pretty stringent measures to try and curb the virus. The virus is increasing at quite a concerning rate in Scotland. We were doing pretty well, but a number of things have meant that the numbers have started to go up again, and so it's right that we take action, for example, in the hospitality sector. But it's one thing to go in and take that action. You can call it a circuit breaker. I don't think we've necessarily called it a circuit breaker in Scotland, but when you look at what people are calling a circuit breaker and what that is actually including, taking an example, action against hospitality, pubs, then that's the kind of thing that we've done last week in Scotland, and we'll see that's going to run for 16 days. We'll see how that goes, but we won't rule anything out going forward. It'll be interesting to see what happens in Northern Ireland. We're currently in our October week at the moment. We're trying to avoid closing down schools because I think, as Andrea's touched on as well, you don't want to have a bad impact when it comes to mental health or education, but it's certainly something we'll look at going forward. But the slight difficulty with this is, and you would expect me to say this as an SNP MP, but there are only so many actions that we can take if we don't have a lot of the powers, and that's why I've been calling for an extension of the furlough scheme, because it's quite right. If you're going to take stringent action in the hospitality sector, yes, you can come forward with that £40 million package, but that's for a period of 16 days. If you really need to take action, you've got to have the furlough scheme in place. So that's why the UK government needs to extend it.
So are you saying that essentially the Welsh and Scottish governments couldn't really do a complete lockdown without the cooperation of the UK government?
Well, I think for so long as the vast majority of tax powers and kind of fiscal levers remain with the United Kingdom government, you are slightly constrained as to what you can do. Because
Northern Ireland have announced it today.
Well, I think Northern Ireland have essentially said that a lot of the action they're going to take is in terms of education. I don't think when you start looking at the retail environment, for example, because if the question is going back to national lockdown, I think everybody wants to avoid that as much as possible for the reasons of mental health. But if you're going to go for something as stringent as that, there's no doubt you've got to have the fiscal levers to do that.
Shabnam Nasimi, do you agree with me that there isn't really a halfway house here? You've either got to go for it and do a proper lockdown or not do it at all. And the problem with a lot of the measures that the UK government have announced, and to some extent I would say also in Scotland, they're kind of a halfway house, trying to keep too many people happy. And in the end, you can't keep everyone happy, can you?
I completely agree. We need to have a more concrete plan forward. Personally, I don't believe that a circuit break or a mini lockdown is a solution to this disease. We don't need another lockdown. And the idea which has to be balanced against the impact on the economy and society would have a catastrophic impact on sort of the long-term stability of Britain. Look, we've got to realise that this disease isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and the country needs to start to begin the process to live with the virus. We need to be able to enable...
But not surely not at these levels. President Macron this evening, I mean, the levels are higher in France, but he's announced a 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew in Paris and 8 other French cities. Now, there's debates about whether curfews are really very effective or not. But if the rate of infections are going to be reduced, there have got to be some very, very stringent measures.
Well, from my understanding of the science behind the circuit breaker, it's to buy us more time and enable a test and trace system to get back up and running. But there doesn't seem to be any plans, certainly not from the Labour side, of how we're going to improve test and tracing. So if we can't improve test and trace in time until the end of the circuit breaker, what's the point of having it at all? I think we need to just ask ourselves some really important questions when it comes to this. Of course, the restrictions are needed, but it needs to be localised. I think the government's approaching this is a very top-down approach, and I think actually we need a lot more decentralisation.
Well, You have guaranteed an invite back, because that's a perfect link into our next question, which is from Chris in Richmond. Chris, go ahead.
Does the panel believe that it is time for the government to hand over all responsibility and budget for testing and tracing to local authorities?
Does the panel believe that it's time the government handed over test and trace to local authorities? Let's go to you, Andrea, first of all.
Well, the best combination is a national system supported with local systems, and that's what the government's seeking to do, because they've got to talk to each other. So if you're living in the United Kingdom, you could travel from one end to the other. As we know, we've got this discussion about Wales, Mark Drakeford potentially trying to stick up a border there. If you are travelling around,
understandably so as well.
Traced. Well, not according to my parliamentary assistant, who lives with her family in Wales and comes to London and would actually really struggle with that. She is a bit, isn't she? As a UK citizen, it's an outrage. So, David, just make sure that your boss doesn't start thinking along those lines. But seriously, you've got to have a national and a local contact tracing system, and those two things can work very well hand in hand, and that's the best way to do it.
We've heard nothing from the government about the local angle to this. I said on the programme last night, I interviewed the Mayor of Blackburn 3 months ago, and he had started a local test and trace system there, and it was working with the national system, and that where the national people couldn't trace someone within 48 hours, they handed it over to his local public health department, and they were getting 90% of people traced. And I thought to myself at the time, well, isn't that the solution? And yet here we are 3 months on, and the penny only seems to be dropping, David Linden. I don't know what happens in Scotland, because you've got problems with test and trace as well.
To nowhere near the same extent. Actually, our compliance rates and success rates are pretty high, well over 90% compared to England, which is at 50 or 60%. There are a number of reasons, I think, for that, Iain. Partly the involvement of the private sector, so getting Deloitte involved, Serco. The Serco system down here in England has been absolutely shocking, whereas we've gone for a public health approach, using public health teams who are using traditional methods, and that's why we're seeing higher rates. But there's no doubt that when you hand this to the private sector, when there's been no capacity for that, in a global pandemic, you're speaking about 48 hours. 48 hours is absolutely crucial. If you can't trace people within 48 hours, then there's a good chance that the virus has spread a lot further than that. So I think the one thing that's been shown with test and trace in England has been the reliance on the private sector with Serco and Deloitte has not worked. And so yes, perhaps they do need to look at devolving it down to local authorities, or looking at health trusts as we've done in Scotland.
That just simply doesn't make sense, to kind of say some kind of ideological private sector bagged state sector good. There is absolutely no evidence that a local authority is able to create a test and trace system from scratch any better than the private sector. And certainly in England now, there's something like 700,000 people have been contacted, traced and asked to self-isolate, which is a significant number from a standing start. There's still a long way to go, but I simply can't agree that there's some ideological better way by using the public sector to deliver these systems.
About ideology, though. I think it's just about the fact that Serco as a company have not set up a test and trace system before, whereas
but
if
who
you look
has?
at the NHS in Scotland, for example, that's why the success rates have been a lot higher in Scotland, is because it is a public health service.
I mean it ought to work, Andrew, didn't it? Because we learned today that the government are paying Boston Consulting £7,340 a day for each consultant that is advising on test and trace. So, I mean, I don't know if they're being paid by results, but if they are, they aren't going to get the full £7,340, are they?
Absolutely right. And that, of course, is one advantage of the private sector as well. And I sincerely hope whoever's procuring those services is making sure that those results are required in order for the payment to be made. But on a serious note, the scale of these systems are so vast that it would be incredibly difficult at a time when the NHS is massively under pressure for them to simply take control also of building from scratch a contact tracing system. It makes sense to use the private sector. Now, they may well have never built a contact tracing system before, but they certainly build systems very rapidly.
I want to go to Richard Burgon on this. Richard, what's the situation in Leeds? I mean, have Leeds City Council, given the size of Leeds, have they got their own local test and trace system, and are they capable of creating one to maybe take up the slack from the national system?
Well, Leeds City Council has retained in the Leeds area local testing facilities, which were certainly very useful at the beginning of the pandemic, and are continuing to be useful now. But I must really take issue with what Andrew said. I'm quite amazed. There is an ideological fixation from the government, and they do believe that it's public sector bad private sector good. And you actually referred earlier you referred to the 90% reach rate when it comes to tracking, when it's local tracking teams doing that. And that's far higher as a success rate in terms of reaching people who may have been exposed to the virus in the private sector. Only a few days ago, I got an email from somebody who wished to remain anonymous, who works for Serco, and this person said, keep up asking the questions about Serco, because this person said that he's been employed by Serco to do the tracing, and he sat there all day doing virtually nothing. He said Serco, this is somebody that works for Serco, is getting money for doing nothing. It's an absolute scandal, an absolute scandal. Serco really needs to be kicked out of this, and the money needs to be put into the NHS. We can do it more effectively. We were promised months and months and months ago a world-beating app. We were promised months and months ago a world-beating test, track and trace system. Neither of those things have occurred months later.
Shabnam, why hasn't that happened? Because I don't think even the government's biggest defenders could not say that this is a world-beating system. Now, it is true that France has had similar experience. I think they've almost abandoned their test and trace system. But how have we got to this point?
I guess, probably from my perspective, why we are in this situation that today is that national debate on the subject hasn't taken place, and I think we need to make sure
we've been talking about little else for the last 4 or 5 months.
And national debate is in, we need to be able to work with local councils, local mayors on the best approach to tackle the levels of cases in their regions. The notion that people sat in Whitehall would understand the challenges faced in communities across the UK is absurd. It's not how the system of government should be working under these particular circumstances. So I would very much advocate for more devolved power, particularly until we beat the coronavirus, which isn't, like I said, isn't going to be anytime soon.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, just before we go to a break, Andrea, is it, given your experience in government, you've worked in various departments, is it the case that the machinery of government is actually at fault here? Not individuals, but just the general machinery of government that hates devolving power, that hates divesting power away from Whitehall to regions, to local authorities. Is that the problem here?
Definitely not. And actually, taking issue with what Richard said, that it's ideologically that the government thinks public sector bad, private sector good, it could not be further from the truth. What the government's been trying to do is to protect the NHS so that it can fulfil its absolutely crucial role, and using the private sector to be able to enhance the capacity of the public sector in the contact tracing. But really importantly is this combination of local contact tracing with national. That's the best way to get full national coverage.
Right, we'll take more of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973. We will do a couple more questions on COVID-19 and then move away. I imagine someone might want to talk about this poll on Scottish independence. You never know. It's 19 minutes past 8.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
22 minutes past 8, you're listening to Cross Question, or watching Cross Question maybe, on the Global Player or the LBC YouTube, Twitter and Facebook feeds. Let's go to our next question. It's Dean in Glasgow. Dean, what would you like to ask?
Hiya, how you doing?
Hi.
With the recent poll this afternoon showing that the majority of Scots would vote sort of yes in the next independence referendum, do we think that the question that we should be asking sort of now is, when will Scotland become an independent country, rather than if Scotland will become an independent country?
I don't know if you were listening to our chatter in the break there, but that's exactly what we were talking about in the studio. Shabnam Nasimi, let me come to you first. There are Conservatives who aren't averse to Scottish independence. What's your view? And do you think it is a question of when rather than if? And as if by magic, she's disappeared on the line. Let's go to Richard Burgon, who I think we've got on the phone now because his line was a bit dodgy too.
Yeah.
The technology is really bearing up tonight. Richard, what's your view on independence? Do you think it's almost inevitable now?
Well, I think it's no wonder that as the government loses more and more control as the government makes a bigger and bigger mess of things in terms of both coronavirus and the economy. We've got a situation where more and more people in Scotland, the opinion polls show, want independence. It's almost like it's directly proportional to the bad performance of the Conservative government.
David Linden, do you buy that? Is it a sort of negative vote rather than a positive pro-independence vote?
Not necessarily. I think it's just an opportunity that people have had to look again at mismanagement from Westminster. There's no doubt that there's absolutely no getting away from it, whether you look at the approval ratings that were in some of these polls, and I think that's maybe been lost today, that the high approval ratings that Nicola Sturgeon's got. But when you look at this kind of bungling Boris government under the Tories and compare it to... And I've got to say, look, I understand nothing prepares you for a pandemic, but the candid way in which the UK government has handled some of this has not been helpful.
Death rates in Scotland...
Death rates
infection rates in Scotland
are
certainly exceeding those in England.
Absolutely, and that's why we're taking action, as you've seen in the last kind of week or so.
You can't really say that Nicola Sturgeon has played it better than Boris Johnson when, if you look at the statistics, they show that they're either the same or worse.
So I think part of it is about public confidence, and what you've seen pretty much every single day of the week is Nicola Sturgeon standing up at the press briefing, levelling with people, talking to them on their level and making sure that they understand exactly what we're going through. And you compare that to a Prime Minister who so often is just absolutely absent. But the issue that I would say, I don't think this necessarily just stems from coronavirus. I think some of it goes back to Brexit as well. Bear in mind, in 2014, people got leaflets through their door saying, the best way of protecting your EU citizenship is to vote no. Now, I happened to vote yes, but I accepted the result in 2014. And that's
Did you really?
Absolutely.
For how long?
Well, I think once the facts change, people have the opportunity to change their mind. People were told, for example, they would have a AAA credit rating. That's not there anymore. People in Scotland voted 62% to remain in the European Union. That was ignored. So I don't think it necessarily just stems from coronavirus. But what is absolutely clear is that there is a mandate, a cast iron mandate now to hold a referendum on independence. And I just think it's completely unsustainable for the United Kingdom government to just keep saying, no, you can't have a referendum. And what you see perhaps at the poll today is that there is an overwhelming direction towards independence, and in particular when you drill down to some of the voting ages as well. I think pretty much every voting demographic
but does
under 60
I'm going to sound like a Remainer in the Brexit referendum now, but does everybody understand the consequences of independence, particularly say on what currency Scotland would use? Somebody tweeted me today said that I must ask you, do you still believe that a independent Scotland could print its own pounds?
Well, I think that this is the big difference between you touched on the EU issue and Scottish independence. In this EU issue, there was a slogan on the side of a bus. In the Scottish Independence campaign, there was a 600-page white paper. Since then, there has been a detailed piece of work, the Growth Commission, which looks quite closely at the economics of independence. And so when you compare the EU issue, which is basically sold in the back of a fag packet, and a lot of thought has gone into what Scottish independence actually looks like, I think there's been a lot more work
we look forward to the detail come the time. Andrea Leadsom, it is a very fair point that David makes there, isn't it? That if in the Scottish elections next year, the SNP go into it on a manifesto of saying if we get 50% of the vote, if we get 50% of the seats, we have got a mandate for another referendum. I don't see how a democratic party, a democratic government could stand in the way of a referendum in those circumstances. Do you?
Well, first of all, a lot of the points David's just made are bunkum, and you're not going to let me take them down one by one, but just suffice to say, the United Kingdom is an incredibly successful union, the most successful union of nations
58%
ever,
of Scottish people don't believe that anymore.
Yeah, but, the referendum was for a generation. And, of course, issues like independence will ebb and flow with views from time to time. But the reality is that for Scotland, as an independent nation, they would have to decide what currency they were going to have. They would be massively reduced in terms of their income because a lot of Scottish services are paid through the Barnett
Project
formula.
Fear springs to mind.
They would have an enormous deficit that they would inherit. No, it's not Project Fear. No, David is saying that they've done the maths and they've found a way for Scottish independence independence to be a success. Well, let's see the maths and then let the Scottish people see the maths in reverse. But actually, fundamentally, we love Scotland, we love the United Kingdom, and it would be the greatest tragedy if Scotland were to leave that incredibly successful Union of Nations. So what the Parliament here has to do is to keep making the case for the UK being stronger together.
The problem you've got is that in 2013, a year before the referendum, there was 29% support for independence in the polls. That's doubled now to 58%. What part of that is so difficult to understand?
It's not difficult to understand at all at any level. I totally understand that people want to see change. They're not happy with the status quo. And there are many people like David who very genuinely want to see Scotland independent. And I totally understand that. But I fundamentally disagree. I think the United Kingdom is very much stronger together. And we love Scotland. We absolutely love beating them at the rugby, for example. And
that's going to win a lot of friends.
And David, just don't leave us, David. Just don't do it.
This is the issue about the democratic deficit that exists in the United Kingdom, because Andrea and Andrea's party were able to go into the election last December on a mandate of saying, get Brexit done. People went, they voted Conservative, I didn't like that, but I accepted at that stage that people had voted by majority for a Conservative government and they had their mandate for Brexit. And so I guess the question that we put back to Andrea is, if the SNP wins the majority at the elections in May, why not allow people to have a referendum on Scottish independence? Because if you win there, you get that mandate as you guys did in December, why can't the people in Scotland have that same opportunity?
So for all sorts of reasons. So for example, in the Brexit referendum, if Remain had won, there is absolutely no way a couple of years on people would be arguing successfully, let's ask the question again. There's just no way. I mean, constitutional issues such as independence, leaving the EU, Human Rights Act, these things are not something you do every couple of years, depending on the shorter term movements in polls. As Iain says, in 2013, 29% of people supported independence. So who's to say what they'll be thinking in 7 years' time from now? That's why you don't have a referendum every 5 minutes. And if you did have a referendum, what would all the Remainers in the United Kingdom have to say about that vis-a-vis the EU? Now we want another referendum on the EU. Okay. It's incredibly divisive. You just can't run nations like that.
Shabnam Nasimi, do you have any sneaking sympathy for Scottish independence, or do you take Andrea's line?
No, I think I completely agree with Andrea here. The Union is a historic alliance that's globally known, and to think that Scotland believes that without any logical plan they would be better off independent doesn't make much sense. And the idea of rerunning a democratic, once in a generation, once in a lifetime vote, I think is beyond the realm of any respectable politics. And I agree, if Remain had won the EU referendum, there would have been no suggestion of a second one. And I think we need to be able to uphold our democratic system. Otherwise, everything crumbles, I guess.
David Linden, if Nicola Sturgeon, I've just had this idea, you can have it for free, if she signed a guaranteed undertaking that if the SNP lost the next independence referendum, say it took place, I don't know, at the end of 2022 or something like that, if she signed a legally binding document that if we lose that, we will not call for another referendum for the next 20 years, that could persuade the Westminster government, couldn't it? Have you had that idea yourself?
Well, I think part of the reason why the Westminster government won't give that Section 30 order to allow a referendum is precisely because they're looking at the polls and they realise that Scotland's on the way out. But you talk about, Nicola Sturgeon signing a bit of paper. This is about so much more than just one politician or any one political party. This is about the people of Scotland who are sovereign, taking the right of determining their own future, because Scotland is a nation and nations are best served.
But if she did that, it would completely...
Scotland taking their own decisions, not a Westminster government they didn't vote for taking their own decisions.
It would completely stuff Andrea's argument, wouldn't it, about a once-in-a-generation thing? She would say, right, if you don't believe us this time, I'll sign it in my blood, and I guarantee that we won't ask for another one for 20 years. I mean, that's the way out of this, isn't it? I'm just trying to help.
Well, I think perhaps we will get to a situation. I think this is going to be very, very difficult for the UK government to continue this kind of bunker mentality. And I guess the question I would say is that almost certainly the Scottish Conservatives are going to go into the election in May and say, vote Scottish Conservatives to stop an independence referendum. But there's going to come a point after polling day when a majority of people, as you can see from the polls today, have voted SNP and given a clear mandate for an independence referendum. The Conservative government can't ignore that, sure.
OK, thank you very much indeed. We will have more of your questions in just a minute. You're listening to Cross
Conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:36 on LBC. If you're just joining us, our panel tonight on Cross Question is David Linden from the SNP, Andrea Leadsom from the Conservatives, Richard Burgon, who's joining us from Leeds for Labour, and Shabnam Nasimi, who's from Conservative Friends of Afghanistan. Right, I have a little bit of breaking news on the Brexit free trade agreement. Actually, it's not particularly interesting, but I'm going to read you that in a minute. But before we do that, let's go to Eric in Liverpool. Eric, what's your question, please?
Hi, Ed. I'd like to direct my question to the whole panel, and it's this. I'm from Liverpool, and we're under a virtual lockdown at the moment. Now, is it fair that some parts of the country, like Liverpool, are under more or less total lockdown, when other parts of the country are not, and they don't have such a high... They have quite a high count as well of corona victims.
Richard Burgon, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because Liverpool has got a high rate of infection, but there are areas of the country that are either more or less equal or, in some cases, slightly higher. What's your answer to Eric?
But it does seem, doesn't it, that certain areas, certain Conservative areas, have avoided extra restrictions in a way that other areas, for example, in West Yorkshire, haven't. In relation to Liverpool, Liverpool obviously is in a very worrying situation. And I think that what people in Liverpool really need is the financial support. The extra financial support really needs to be there. But also they need some light at the end of the tunnel, which is why in the opening of this programme we were discussing the need for the government to pursue a new strategy. The strategy they pursued has ended up with Liverpool being in the awful situation it is. That wasn't inevitable. So that's why I've been pursuing this idea of calling on the government to take a zero COVID approach. I saw a photo just a few days ago of a rugby game in New Zealand, the stadium packed, not putting people at risk, but the stadium packed safely because the virus has been, in effect, eliminated there. Now, if it can be done in New Zealand through pursuing a different strategy, it can be done here. But what we've got...
You can't really compare a country like New Zealand with, I think, 5 million people without any major cities comparable to ours in terms of population and population density. How can you possibly compare a country like New Zealand to here?
The capital of New Zealand has a population much bigger than Liverpool. The density of the capital of New Zealand is comparable with major cities in this country. It's not the case that this is just a countryside only nation. You know, people have spun that for their own ends. The reality is being able to get a grip of it in New Zealand and in South Korea and in Vietnam. If it can be done there, why should we believe it's impossible here? And that's why it really disturbs me when we have people like Andrea and people in the Conservative cabinet saying we've got to learn to live with it. What they mean by that is we just have to accept a lot of people are going to die. We just got to accept that the economy won't return to normal because it is going to go on and on and on. It's not inevitable. The government shouldn't admit defeat. They should listen to the scientists, because otherwise what hope do people in places like Liverpool and other places have that this will ever end?
Andrew is about to explode, but I'm going to give her time to calm down and go to Shabnam instead. Shabnam, you were shaking your head during much of what Richard was saying there.
I don't agree. You know, if a lockdown does occur, and as the guest caller mentioned, why should certain regions where cases are much lower suffer as a result of a national approach? If a lockdown does occur, it should be based on local levels, not national, because, like I said, people shouldn't suffer as a result of different regions and the levels of cases. And the tier system should be down to devolved administration and local decisions. Look, the April lockdown hit the economy incredibly hard. The economy shrank by a fifth or 20%. It cost us third of £1 trillion quid. So a 2-week circuit breaker will be, yes, less intensive, but could hit the economy by 5% more. Definitely sending an already slowing recovery back into reverse and stretching out further the period of recovery. What we need now is allowing, again, local administrations to make the decisions of whether a lockdown is necessary, because what we're talking about here is livelihoods. People's lives are in our hands, and we need to allow local data to guide us.
OK, David Linden, this question applies in Scotland as well. You've got the Central Belt in partial lockdown, other areas not at all. Eric is saying this is essentially unfair.
I've got a lot of sympathy for Eric, who finds himself in a situation where, Liverpool's locked down, and I know from my own situation in Glasgow, and we've had pretty stringent lockdown restrictions for several weeks, indeed months now. But I would refer you probably to the case where, Aberdeen, a couple of months ago, we had to take pretty radical action in Aberdeen, which there was a pretty big outbreak there. And so you've got to make sure that you don't take a one-size-fits-all approach, and that's why perhaps a tiered system is something worth looking at. But certainly I would argue that the localised version is much better at doing it, because what works for Aberdeen might not necessarily work in some parts of the Outer Hebrides, for example. So the localised system does seem to work. We saw that with Aberdeen, where the numbers did come down after that period. There's no doubt as we moved into the kind of autumn period and as we go into winter flu season, the numbers have gone back up again. But the idea that you would do it by a localised basis certainly is something I'm a bit more of a fan of. But I have absolute sympathy for Eric, who's going through a situation within Tier 3.
Now, Andrea, my constant quest to generate light rather than heat, have you simmered down?
I have. Thank you for the opportunity to calm down. And I must say, I think Shabnam's exactly right. And I also agree.
Determined to get you two to disagree in this somewhere.
I think she's hit absolutely spot on. And I also completely agree with David. I too am very sympathetic to Eric's point of view. I mean, it is tough when you're the place in lockdown and you're genuinely having to suffer as a result of that. But I mean, Richard's point was just incoherent. On the one hand, his boss is saying, let's lock the whole country down. And then on the other hand, he's saying it's not fair to Eric to make him be locked down. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. Either you want to have a complete lockdown of our economy with all the consequences for people's social, mental well-being, as well as their livelihoods, or you want to do what the government's seeking to do, which is to make sure that where there is a real problem in a particular local area, that can be got on top of and brought down to a manageable level. And that's got to be the way forward.
Richard, just to come back to you, isn't it sensible, though, to have this regional approach or local approach where, depending on the infection rate, you have certain measures in one area? If you put the whole country in lockdown, you've got various areas of the country that do not have high infection rates at the moment. Yes, they are rising. You would be right to point that out. But there are so many areas that would think, well, why are we being put into lockdown? There isn't a problem here.
Well, right across the country, the R rate is above 1. So eventually, if it carries on like this, everywhere will get into a very, very worrying situation. But in relation to this, the zero COVID approach ends up, once you've achieved it, in a situation where you lock down cases, not the country, where you lock down cases, not the economy. The reason that these restrictions that we're calling for, that the scientists are calling for and we agree with, are necessary, is because a mess has been made of this since the beginning of this pandemic. That's why there are restrictions now. That's why there's lockdowns now. That's why a circuit break is necessary now.
But these restrictions and lockdowns are happening in virtually every single European country. This is not just unique to this country, is it?
That's right. It's a worrying situation right across Europe, but we have one of the highest death tolls in the world, and we have one of the biggest economic impacts of the coronavirus in the world as well. And so therefore, Einstein said, the definition of madness is carrying on doing the same thing, expecting a different result. The government's approach has completely failed. We need to change course. Look at the countries that have successfully dealt with this, and let's see what we can learn from them.
Okay.
Because when I see the pictures of the people safely at the rugby stadium in New Zealand, I think that's what people in Liverpool want. That's what people in Leeds want. But they don't want to be risking the lives of people and their family to do that. They want to be able to do it safely. The government's approach so far has offered no end in sight. The government's approach so far has falsely pitted the economy against public health, but actually adequately protected neither. We've got so many jobs at risk, and we've also had tens of thousands of people die unnecessarily, and that, I'm afraid, is the government's responsibility.
Can I just step in there? Sorry. But
very, very quickly.
If the government approach hasn't worked, why would you urge for another national lockdown? Do you not think we're repeating the same mistake again? It doesn't make any sense. I guess you're contradicting yourself in that respect.
I'm going to leave that question hanging because we do need to go to a break, and we'll take more of your calls in just a second. You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 8.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It is 10 to 9 on LBC. You're listening to Cross Question. Now, Downing Street have issued a statement from the Prime Minister. He's been talking with Ursula von der Leyen. Remember that tomorrow is the deadline that the Prime Minister set for the completion of the EU trade talks. The statement says, the leaders discussed the latest state of play of the negotiations on our future relationship with the EU ahead of the October European Council. That starts tomorrow. The Prime Minister noted the desirability of a deal, but expressed his disappointment that more progress had not been made over the past 2 weeks. The Prime Minister said that he looked forward to hearing the outcome of the European Council and would reflect before setting out the UK's next steps in the light of his statement of the 7th of September. Some belligerent noises, I think, have been coming from both camps over the past few days, not unusual in these sorts of negotiations. Simple question for all four of you. Do you think that there is going to be a free trade agreement by the 31st of December? David, let's come to you first.
Well, I think everybody wants to make sure that there's some sort of agreement in place, because the idea of having, a pandemic, a recession associated with that, and then this complete no deal would be a complete disaster for everybody. But the reality is that the European Union have instigated this legal action because of the unlawful internal market.
They've got 48 against Germany as well. This is nothing unusual.
And the idea that the UK is trying to strike an agreement, this is not a particularly good backdrop to do that against. And this is just a history of Boris Johnson, the Conservative government, antagonising the European Union. Let's not forget, this is a deadline that was set by Boris Johnson himself. This is another example of Boris Johnson behaving cat-candidly, bungling around. And I think the statement we've seen tonight is Downing Street don't actually have much to say, because once again they've been left embarrassed by Boris making these rather large pronouncements about what's going to happen, and the statement you've heard tonight is completely vacuous.
Shabnam Nasimi, of course, the brinkmanship did work last year on the withdrawal agreement. Contrary to what most people thought, he did get that by hook or by crook. Do you think history is going to repeat itself, or do you think the brinkmanship this time might not work? Shabnam, are you there? I think she's frozen. Andrea, let's come to you.
Well, I sincerely hope so. It's clearly in their interests and in our interests. I do think that the EU has shown itself extremely intractable and has not been willing to negotiate in good faith. There have been some red line areas that you would not expect to see in any free trade agreement with any countries, let alone ones who've been trading tariff-free and non-tariff barrier-free for 45 years. So I think it's been an incredibly difficult situation, and I sincerely hope that they do sign up to.
Do you think they will, though?
A proper deal? Yeah, I still think it's possible. I think it has to be clear that I'm less optimistic than a month ago, but I think it is still possible.
Richard Burgon.
Well, I have no confidence in Boris Johnson, and that's not just because of the disastrous way he's handled coronavirus. Well, at the end of the day, he's made a lot of promises. Will he be able to deliver this by a self-imposed deadline? I don't know. I don't have any great confidence that he's going to do that. And of course, we're in a situation at the moment where we're entering the kind of recession that none of us have ever lived through before. That's the scale it's going to be. So it's not a good backdrop for a free market fanatic like Boris Johnson to be negotiating this deal. So I'm afraid I don't have any confidence that he's going to be able to get something which helps people in my constituency or people across the country.
Shabnam, do you think the brinkmanship is going to work?
I'm hopeful that we hopefully might be able to meet that deadline, but I'm not optimistic considering the current situation when it comes to coronavirus and lockdowns and all.
But that surely ought to drive both. That ought to drive both sides to an agreement, surely.
No, I completely agree, but I guess the focus is most of the government's manpower is on one side of domestic, I guess, challenges, and from my side, I'm not sure whether we are going to meet the deadline.
Right, we've got time for one more question and a text, so if you can keep your answers relatively brief on the next question. It's from Andrew in Chigwell. Andrew, what would you like to ask?
Yes, good evening. I would like to know, why are so many people ignoring the government guidelines which are being given?
Give me an example.
With regards to wearing face masks, social distancing, going in crowds, going in parties.
Okay. I don't know how many of you have seen this video of people in Liverpool, young people, it has to be said, sort of carousing, to use a word which doesn't get used very often, in the street last night. Shabnam, let's come to you. Why do you think that, or do you agree that so many people are ignoring guidelines?
I think it's mostly to do with uncertainty. The current government guidelines aren't very... A lot of them don't make sense. I mean, with the fact that at 10 o'clock most restaurant and bars do close, a lot of people do find other means to socialise. And when it comes to sort of no social distancing or wearing masks, I think, contrary to what to the data that we're receiving, people are frustrated with the situation, and that's where personal responsibility comes in. We need to be able to enable individuals and citizens to be responsible human beings within Britain and make those decisions themselves, rather than enforcing restrictions upon them. And I guess like I said, I think we're now in a second stage. There is a possibility that if the lockdown does occur, once it's relaxed, that there will be a third wave and a fourth wave. So I guess it's not a sustainable plan, and that, like I said at the beginning, we need to learn to live with the virus if it continues in the direction that we're seeing. People need to be able to decide for themselves whether how to take responsibility.
Richard, it is in the end all about individual responsibility, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure you've seen it. Coming into London today at Charing Cross Station, normally virtually everyone has got a mask on. Today I noticed quite a few people that didn't, and of course my instinct is to immediately say to them, why aren't you wearing a mask? I don't do it for obvious reasons, but I think most people who are obeying the rules look at people like that and think, what are you playing at?
I mean, most people are doing what they're meant to be doing. When I go around where I live in Leeds, most people are doing what they're meant to be doing. But the reason that some people aren't is because of the mixed messaging from the government. It's not too long ago, in August, that the message the government was giving was everything is back to normal, it's not a problem. You have the Chancellor looking like a complete prat, to be honest, walking around Wagamamas, grinning, giving out food. That's a symbol that everything's back to normal. They were saying, eat out to help out. It's your patriotic duty to go to the pub. And then you've got Donald Trump, of course, saying what he's saying about it being no big deal. When it comes to the government in this country, they've given big signals and big signs that it's all fine. And the other reason some people aren't doing what they should be doing is because people have no hope the government's going to sort this out. They have no hope this will ever end because the government's made such a mess of it, and therefore people despair.
Okay, Andrea and David, I've got to ask you to be very, very, very brief. David first.
I think part of it is we've asked people to stick with us for quite a long time, and there might be a degree of fatigue kicking in. But what I would say by way of cautioning people is, first time around Iain in March, I didn't know anybody in my immediate circle that had coronavirus. This time around, we can see the infections are increasing, and one of my own members of staff had it within the last couple of weeks. Now, she was self-isolating, she's been working from home, but if we don't start to take action soon, we're going to see an increase in the virus, and we can't have that. That's why we need to follow it.
Andrea?
Well, I find myself completely agreeing with David, which
marvellous.
is
This
marvellously
is what I like to do,
short.
bring people together. Right, final quick text from Terry in Kingsthorpe. Russia's Soyuz rocket has travelled from Earth to the International Space Station in record time. What will happen first, HS2 or colonising Mars? Andrea, as a great fan of HS2.
Oh, yes, a big fan. Yeah, it's definitely colonising Mars. Mm-hmm.
You hope?
Well, seriously, HS2, I don't think the project is good value for taxpayers' money. I think there could be better uses for that money in providing better transport, particularly in the north of England and all the way to Scotland. But really importantly, as a constituency MP affected, the way that HS2 have treated my constituents is just appalling. It's not efficient.
Richard, very briefly, what is this I read about HS2 not actually coming to Leeds after all?
Yeah, well, it's another example of the fact that the Conservatives talk big about the North and then don't deliver whatever concerns people may have about HS2, and I have some. They've talked big but didn't deliver, and they didn't even start the HS2 in the North like they would have done if it was really about boosting jobs and the economy in the North as they claimed originally.
Next time you come on, Richard, my challenge is going to get you to say something nice about the Conservatives.
It's a challenge you might never pass, I'm afraid.
You can wear a blue jumper.
Indeed, Shabnam.
I'd keep it brief and say I think we'd colonise Mars before HS2 happens. I agree with that.
I thought that might be one thing you might disagree with, Andrew, on, but clearly not. David?
I think it's fair to say Britain's done enough colonising, so let's try and make sure that we have a situation
controversial.
We have HS2 in place.
Well, thank you all for bearing with us over the last hour. Richard Burgon, Shabnam Nasimi, Andrea Leadsom and David Linden. Next week, among our guests will be Brandon Lewis, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Jeff Norcott, the comedian, and Kezia Dugdale, former Scottish Labour leader, now with the John Smith Institute. So do join us then. Coming up in the next hour, it's the LBC Business Hour. Emma Jones will join us, and we'll also be joined by Chartered Accountant Andrew Henderson, who can answer your questions on finance. If you run a small business, but you can't get the finance that you need to expand it, do give us a call. Love to hear from you. We had some calls last week from people who couldn't open new bank accounts because their banks are not accepting new business accounts. Can you believe? So we'd like to hear more about that as well. It's 9:01.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Northern Ireland is facing a 4-week circuit breaker lockdown to try to stop the spread of coronavirus. Pubs and restaurants will have to shut from Friday evening. School half-term is being extended to a fortnight. Jeremy Armstrong, a primary school head in Belfast, is worried about even tighter measures being brought in.
I think 2 weeks we can, at this stage, handle. Whilst it will have an impact on the children, it's manageable.